Why do we have to learn about DNA? Why is that required knowledge? I had a student, a graduate student no less, ask me this years ago. Why do I have to learn that? He said. So let's talk about why learning about DNA or science in general is important. Let's talk about Kevin. Sage started dating Kevin about 2 years before this incident. Things seemed to be going all right between them. Then talk of taking the relationship seriously came up, marriage, becoming a family, etc. And that's when the relationship began to die. Kevin announced that he wanted to do a DNA test on Sage's kids to make sure they were his. The kids who were 5 and 3 when Sage and Kevin started dating. Now, so he knows these kids are not his. Why would he want a DNA test? He has some pretty weird ideas about how DNA works. Let's come back to Kevin. So I'm Dr. Peter Allen. I have my PhD in analytical chemistry, bachelor's in biochemistry, and I learned a lot about DNA over the years. It was kind of my specialty. One reason for requiring something in the curriculum is because it might be necessary for a future job. But Kevin is never going to get a job working with DNA. He's going to be lucky to get a job that requires a food safety permit. So I made this little comic. Why do we have to learn this? Some of your smarter classmates will need it for their careers. Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal did the original better version. I'm going to link to that in the description. This one's just a little more specific to DNA. Now, there are jobs for people who know stuff. In this case, there are jobs for people who know about the structure and function of DNA. There are doctors and geneticists, bioengineers. But let's say you don't need to know about DNA for your job. That doesn't make you a Kevin. Should we just leave the DNA to the DNA people? Should we leave science to the scientists? What about curiosity? Curiosity is my favorite reason to learn about science. I've always been curious about how things work. Science is the best way to answer those questions. I earned my PhD in chemistry because I liked things that could be verified and tested. It's good to know how things work. It's worth understanding how people figured things out. Our world is fascinating. DNA is a beautiful part of our world. It's part that we did figure out, even though it was hard. There's a Jeff Goldblum movie about it. It's neat. Like, here's a question I found on Quora, a site where curious people ask curious questions and sometimes try to get people to do their homework for them. This person was curious about DNA, and I approve. What's the difference between DNA and genes? Do souls carry DNA? Is it the same thing for humans and animals alike? Here's my answer. DNA is a chemical. It's a physical molecule. It's a substance that can be extracted and measured like oil or sugar. In biology, the DNA molecule is used to store information about how to do cell stuff. Sometimes DNA is called the blueprint of the cell because it stores instructions to build everything about the cell. DNA can also store instructions that lead cells to build themselves into bigger things like trees and animals and people. When humans study these instructions in the DNA, we call them genes. We know quite a bit about how the information in DNA works, how biology uses that information. For instance, some people have blue eyes, some people have brown eyes. We know what parts of the DNA in people cause those traits. We might call those parts of human DNA the eye-color genes. Let's make an analogy. DNA is like a physical book, a thing we can hold and weigh. Genes are like the words written in the book, the information stored. Now, what's a soul? See, I don't have a good answer for you. We never found a physical thing that is a soul that we can hold or weigh. I think maybe the soul is like the mind, a property of the brain. Maybe it's the patterns that the brain makes when we do people stuff. Now, if that's true, then the soul doesn't have DNA, but humans and animals could have them. One of the things that inspires my curiosity in science is, how do we know that? When I was a kid, I asked that question endlessly. I like to think I still ask that question endlessly. The great thing about science is that there's always an answer to how do we know that. It's never just because, or because I said so. I don't know the answer to the soul part of the question. Whether the soul is the source of our imagination or a figment of it, I'm pretty sure it doesn't have DNA. I'm pretty sure that for souls, how do we know that? Comes down to because I said so. Fundamentally, it's a different kind of question. What's DNA? What are genes? Those are experimental questions. How do we know that DNA holds information? Well, we could see from the microscope that cells have chromosomes, and we could figure out that chromosomes had a lot to do with heredity. When chromosomes were isolated and purified and analyzed, they were made of DNA. Scientists did experiments with DNA and correlated specific DNA results with specific inherited outcomes. Then they got inspired and stored digital data on DNA just to prove they could. It's all experiments, all the way down. I love that. So if someone asks, why do we have to learn that? I might respond, well, aren't you curious? But maybe they aren't. What if someone is just not curious? They don't have a fascination with experiments or evidence. The pure joy of knowledge is irrelevant to them. But what about citizenship? I might respond, why do I have to learn that? With this information has been deemed important by educational experts who set it as a prerequisite for graduating from this course of study. These experts set a standard for what should count as a minimally educated citizen in our shared modern world. Learning this is one step to meeting that standard. DNA, other stuff like it, facts, might not be relevant on a day-to-day basis, but we want people to be prepared to function in a world where people do use this information. We want people to be good citizens who can function as a part of our democracy. Ignorant people cannot serve that function. They must trust more in people who do have that knowledge. So even because the state curriculum board says so, has something to do with our values as in a society like democracy and citizenship. Why do I have to learn this? Well, in the end, if you don't care about citizenship and you don't care about curiosity and you're not going to get a job doing this, then how about consumerism? It's less important than any of those other things, but people are consumers. A DNA test is a thing you can buy. You should know what DNA is, what it does, so that you can be an informed consumer. Knowledge is useful to prevent scams, making foolish choices, so you don't end up like Kevin. Do you want to be a Kevin? Here's the story about Kevin. Sage started dating about 2 years before this incident. Things seemed to be going all right between them. She told me he was a bit of a derp and sometimes incredibly oblivious. He couldn't pick up on cues, even suggestions flew over his head. So she just switched behavior from talking to a neurotypical to talking to neurodivergent, and the bump smoothed out for a while. All was well and good. Then the talk of taking the relationship seriously came up. Marriage, becoming a family, etc. And that's when the relationship began to die. Kevin announced that he wanted to DNA test Sage's kids to make sure they were his. Kids who were 5 and 3 when they started dating. Sage said she had to come to a full stop in the conversation for several seconds while her brain rebooted. Sage said, "They're not your kids. You know they're not your kids. My ex-husband and I had them together before I ever met you." Kevin replied, "Yeah, and now we're getting married. They'll become mine. I just want a DNA test and make sure of it." Let me see if I understand this. Do you actually think my children's DNA will change to become biologically yours? Obviously, I just want a confirmation on paper is all. There was a long conversation about how DNA didn't work that way. He insisted that everything pointed to the kids becoming theirs. Kevin's mom had to become involved to back Sage up. His dad had to become involved to back Sage up. A few books had to get involved to back Sage up. And Kevin was furious. How could any kid who wanted to be adopted refuse to change one little thing so they could have parents? It doesn't work that way is a bullshit excuse. He ranted and raved, and right in front of his own parents, he told them that if her kids weren't going to become his kids, then the marriage wasn't going to happen. He told her he would give them a week to change their minds and agree to be his biological kids. He said that when they stopped being selfish, when the DNA proved it, he'd take them in. Now, just think about that for a second. He wanted a DNA test to prove that his, maybe future stepkids, had changed their DNA. He insisted that they should do that out of gratitude. One wonders if he thinks that he can alter his own DNA. No one can change their own DNA. How did he get this crazy idea that he could change his DNA? Well, he was not going to accept reality if it contradicted his expectations. And that's the key to science denial. My preferences come first, reality is second. It's not just that he's a bad consumer and likely to get duped. It's not just that he's incurious, and that is sad. It's that he is like this because he's not equipped to be a good citizen. He's not equipped to help society make rational choices. So do you have any stories like this? Have you run across some of this on the internet? Not just like science illiteracy, but confidently reality contradictory. I hate this stuff, but I can't look away. I've been reading The War on Science and How to Talk to a Science Denier, and this kind of thing has just fascinated me. How can we address it? If you have juicy anti-science, drop me a link in the comments or send me an email. I've put a temporary phone number in the description and the pinned comment, and get in touch. Maybe I can use your question or comment in a future video. I will leave you anonymous unless you request otherwise. Think of it as a hot tip line for Daily Dose of Internet, but it's the daily dose of really bad science. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.